The great hall of Oakhaven buzzed with a chaotic energy that only the presence of an alpha king could summon. Zuri moved through the crowd like a shadow, her tray of silver heavy against her palms. The air carried the thick, expensive scent of Bastien's cologne, a mixture of cedar and ancient spice. Suddenly, a sound like a mountain splitting apart roared through the chamber as a chandelier plummeted, shattering against the mahogany floor. Shards of glass flew like a metallic rain. Every noblewoman screamed. Every guard drew a sword. Panic turned the room into a sea of frantic movement. Yet, at the head of the table, King Bastien remained a statue of obsidian grace. He continued to lift his glass, his gaze fixed on the distance, his broad shoulders relaxed. He remained oblivious to the carnage behind him. Yet the roar of the explosion had failed to reach him. Silence was his only companion in a room full of noise. In that frozen second, while the world fell apart, Zuri realized the truth. The Alpha King was existing in a world of absolute silence. The aftermath left the halls smelling of dust and the faint tang of metallic blood. Zuri stood amidst the wreckage, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. While the other servants bowed their heads and trembled, Zuri kept her eyes lifted, her gaze locked onto the king's back. She watched him turn slowly, his movements controlled and feline. His obsidian eyes swept the room, searching for the source of the frantic energy he could feel but failed to hear. "Lower your gaze, girl," the head housekeeper hissed, her hand catching Zuri's arm with painful force. The woman forced Zuri to her knees on the cold stone. To look upon the Alpha King with such boldness was a crime of arrogance. Punishment was the sole answer for a servant who forgot her place. Zuri felt the sting of the housekeeper's palm across her cheek, yet she remained defiant. She refused to offer the expected tears. Bastien stepped toward them, his boots clicking rhythmically against the mahogany. He stopped directly in front of Zuri. The scent of his cologne enveloped her again, thick and grounding. The court held its breath, expecting the king to order her execution for such a public display of arrogance. He reached down, his fingers catching her chin, forcing her to look at him once more. Up close, his soul blazed with a fierce, lonely intensity that stole her breath. He searched her face. His eyes narrowed as if trying to read the very thoughts behind her dark pupils. The world thought he was judging her arrogance. They believed he was punishing her with his silence. In reality, Zuri saw the truth in the way his jaw tightened. He was watching her lips. He was searching for a sign of what had occurred while his world remained quiet. She was the sole person in the room he was truly seeing, and for the first time in her life, Zuri felt the weight of being chosen. The great hall stood bathed in the amber glow of 1,000 candles, their light dancing across the polished mahogany of the royal dais. Today was selection day, the moment the Alpha King would identify the woman to stand at his side. Every noble house had spent years preparing their daughters for this singular instant. They stood in perfect rows, draped in silks that shimmered like a metallic sea. Zuri stood at the very edge of the hall, her simple cotton dress a stark contrast to the velvet surrounding her. The head housekeeper had shoved her into the line as a final act of humiliation, a way to show the king the lowest of his subjects. The heavy doors groaned open, and Bastien entered. He moved with the grace of a predator, his suit the color of obsidian, his presence filling every corner of the room. The air became thick with the scent of his cologne, a powerful fragrance that made Zuri's pulse quicken. He began his walk. He passed the first row of princesses, his expression opaque. He walked past the second row, his gaze cutting through the jewels and perfumes as if they were mist. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the king reached the back of the hall. Yet he stopped directly in front of Zuri. The world became a quiet vacuum where solely the two of them existed. Bastien reached out, his hand steady as he captured her chin once more. He looked into her eyes, searching for the shared secret they held since the explosion. "This one," he stated, his voice a low vibration that Zuri felt in her very bones. Shock turned the room into a tomb of silence. The noblewomen stood frozen while the king took Zuri's hand, his skin warm and firm against hers. He led her away from the gaping crowd, through corridors lined with heavy velvet drapes that muffled the sound of their footsteps. They entered a private study where a fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across walls lined with ancient maps. The room felt heavy with secrets. Bastien left her hand and moved to a mahogany desk, his back turned to her. Zuri stood still, the silence of the room reflecting the silence within the king. He turned, holding a small silver blade. He drew it across his palm with a swift motion, and dark droplets of metallic blood pooled in his hand. He offered the hilt to her, his obsidian eyes commanding her to join him in a pact that would change her life forever. Zuri took the blade, the cool metal a promise of power. She pressed her palm to his, their metallic blood mingling as a golden light flared between them. In that moment, she was a maid purely in name. She was now the king's choice, the sole person allowed into his world of silence and velvet secrets. Bastien led Zuri into the heart of his private sanctuary. The study stood as a cathedral of mahogany and heavy velvet, the air thick with the rich, comforting scent of his cologne. He sat at his massive obsidian desk, his posture regal and firm. He gestured for Zuri to approach, his eyes reflecting the flickering candle flames. He placed a heavy metallic bowl upon the wood and tapped the side. A low hum vibrated through the room, a rhythmic pulse that traveled through the mahogany. He pointed to his chest, then to her, signaling for her to feel the tremor of the sound. Zuri reached out, her fingers brushing the wood, feeling the vibration in her teeth. She understood her purpose. She would be the bridge between his quiet world and the sounds of the court. Bastien rose, his movements fluid and powerful. He stood behind her, his height a protective presence. He placed his hands upon her shoulders, and a jolt of recognition surged through her skin. The mate bond thrummed, and a golden thread connecting their souls. He began to teach her the language of touch. A light tap on her right shoulder signaled a presence from the east. A firm press on her left indicated a visitor from the west. They practiced for hours, their bodies moving in a rhythmic dance within the obsidian shadows. The solely scent was the cedar of the room and the tang of the metallic blood they shared in their bond. Zuri realized her arrogance was transforming into a fierce loyalty. She would be his ears. She would hear the whispers of the halls and the truths of the court. She would protect the secret of the Alpha King with her very life. Bastien leaned close, his breath warm against her ear. He spoke solely with his eyes, expressing a gratitude that passed every word. In this room of velvet and secrets, the maid and the king became a strong force, bound by silence and the thrum of a shared heart. Zuri returned to the royal kitchens, the expansive chambers where her life as a servant had first begun. The air was heavy and warm, carrying the comforting aromas of roasting game and seasoned mahogany. Massive prep tables carved from dark mahogany stood like fortresses in the center of the room, their surfaces scarred by decades of service. Copper and silver ladles hung from the ceiling, their polished surfaces casting a metallic glow across the stone walls. The other servants paused in their tasks, their eyes widening as they saw Zuri. They noticed the fine silk of her new garments and the way she carried herself with even greater arrogance than before. She ignored their stares, her chin lifted high, her presence as sharp as the obsidian daggers the king favored. And she moved through the steam and the heat, her eyes scanning the room for the general's personal staff. She knew the power of being overlooked. In the eyes of the nobility, a maid was a part of the furniture, an object that existed solely to facilitate their comfort. Zuri embraced this invisibility. She picked up a heavy metallic tray and began to polish the silver, her movements rhythmic and precise. She positioned herself near the roasting pits where the general's head guard was sharing a flagon of ale with the palace cooks. The bond of metallic blood thrummed in her veins, a warm vibration that connected her soul to Bastien's. Even in this chaotic, noisy kitchen, she could feel him. She could smell the faint, ghostly scent of his cologne, that blend of cedar and ancient spice clinging to her skin. It gave her the courage to stay, to listen, and to learn. The guards spoke in low, hushed tones, their voices barely audible over the crackle of the hearth. They discussed the upcoming selection ball, their faces tight with a secret intensity. They spoke of the general's rising ambition and his desire to see the kingdom led by a man who could respond to the commands of his army with his own ears. They whispered about a specific device, a metallic instrument crafted by the northern alchemists, designed to emit a sound so piercing it would force every living creature to their knees. "The king will be tested," one guard muttered, his hand resting on his sword hilt. "If he remains standing while the rest of us fall, the truth will be exposed. A man who hears nothing has no place on the throne of an alpha." Zuri's heart hammered against her ribs. She kept her gaze fixed on the silver tray, her reflection appearing distorted in the metallic surface. The general was planning to expose Bastien's silence in front of the entire court. The stakes were higher than she had imagined. If the king was revealed as deaf, the laws of the realm would demand his immediate removal. The general would step into the void, and the peace of Oakhaven would be shattered. She felt the vibration of the metallic blood bond intensify. Bastien was thinking of her, his silent world reaching out to hers. She realized that she was his solely defense. She was the ears he required to survive the coming storm. Her arrogance, once a shield to protect her own heart, was now a weapon she would use to protect her king. Zuri finished her task with deliberate slowness. She placed the silver tray upon the mahogany table and turned to leave. She avoided the suspicious gaze of the head housekeeper, her steps light and purposeful. She had the information. She had the secret. She began the long climb back to the obsidian study, her mind already forming a plan to counter the general's move. She would stand with Bastien. Together, they would turn his silence into a strength that would leave their opponents in awe. The ballroom stood as a monument of mahogany and gold, its expansive floor polished to a mirror-like shine that reflected the flickering light of 1,000 candles. Zuri moved across the surface, her presence a sharp contrast to the delicate noblewomen who had occupied this space before her. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk, the fabric clinging to her frame with a graceful arrogance. Bastien waited at the center of the hall, his form draped in obsidian silk that seemed to absorb the very light of the room. The scent of his cologne, that intoxicating blend of cedar and ancient spice, filled the air and anchored Zuri to the present moment. The orchestra began to play. The music was a tidal wave of sound, a complex arrangement of strings and brass that filled the hall with a majestic energy. For Bastien, the world remained perfectly silent. Yet as the rhythm intensified, a metallic vibration pulsed through the mahogany floorboards. It traveled up through his boots, a rhythmic heartbeat that he could feel in his very bones. Zuri felt it too, the thrum of the bass resonating within her chest. She approached him, her hand extending with a confidence that mirrored his own. When their skin made contact, a jolt of recognition surged through them both. The metallic blood bond, forged in secret, flared with a sudden brilliant intensity. It was a golden thread that bound their souls together across the silence. Bastien pulled her close, his hand resting firmly on the small of her back. They began to move, their steps perfectly synchronized with the pulse of the floor. Zuri looked into his obsidian eyes and saw a universe of emotion. She saw the fierce purpose that drove him and the profound, aching loneliness that he had carried for so long. She realized that her own arrogance had been a shield against the world, much like his silence was a fortress. Within the rhythm of the dance, those barriers crumbled. She felt a sense of belonging, a feeling like coming home to a place she had only dreamed of. The music reached a crescendo, the metallic resonance of the cymbals shimmering through the air. Bastien spun her, his strength effortless, his gaze meeting hers constantly. He leaned down, his forehead pressing against hers in a gesture of absolute trust. Beyond the reach of words, the message stayed clear. They were two halves of a single whole, destined to face the coming storm together. The bond pulsed brighter now, a steady heartbeat that told Zuri that she was exactly where she belonged. She was the ears of the king, and he was the heart that beat solely for her. Their connection remained firm, a truth that traitors remained powerless to alter. The grand banquet hall sparkled with the brilliance of 1,000 candles, their light dancing across the vaulted ceiling. The air stayed thick with the aroma of the Alpha King's cologne, and a fragrance of cedar and deep spice that anchored Zuri to the present. Bastien occupied his obsidian throne at the head of the mahogany table, his posture regal and calm. He sat in a world of absolute silence, yet his presence commanded every soul in the room. Zuri stood just behind him, her emerald silk gown rustling softly. Her eyes remained sharp and observant, scanning the faces of the counselors seated before them. She used the gift her mother had once described as a sacred sight, the ability to see the truth of a human spirit. Lord Malin stood, his movements fluid and rehearsed. He held a metallic chalice high, the silver surface gleaming under the candlelight. He spoke of loyalty and a prosperous future for Oakhaven. While the other guests cheered and lifted their glasses, Zuri focused her sight. She looked at the man. She really looked. Beneath his polished exterior, his soul writhed with a dark, oily energy. It resembled a nest of vipers fighting in the mud, their scales slick with greed and betrayal. The shadow of his spirit appeared twisted, a sharp contrast to the warm smiles he offered the court. The metallic blood bond between Zuri and the king pulsed against her ribs, a warm and urgent vibration. It was a golden thread of recognition that allowed her to feel his steady heartbeat. She leaned close to the king's ear, her presence a grounding force in his silent world. She whispered the truth with a quiet confidence. The wine holds a silent death. The man before you is a traitor with a rotting soul. Bastien remained perfectly still. He reached out and took the metallic chalice from Malin's trembling hand. He held the vessel high, the liquid within reflecting the deep obsidian of his eyes. He watched the Lord's face, his gaze cutting through the man's mask like a blade. Bastien saw the flicker of terror in the man's expression. With a slow, deliberate motion, the king tilted the cup. The dark wine splashed onto the mahogany table, staining the wood like a fresh wound. The room stayed silent as the liquid soaked into the grain. Malin collapsed to his knees, his composure shattering. He begged for mercy while the guards stepped forward to seize him. Bastien rose, his stature immense and terrifying. He looked at Zuri, his expression softening for a brief second. He gave her a single, firm nod of gratitude. Her arrogance had saved him. Her eyes had seen the invisible threat that everyone else had missed. Their bond felt stronger than ever, and a golden bridge of trust in a court filled with shadows. Shadows lengthened along the polished mahogany corridors as Zuri walked toward the royal chambers. The air remained still, yet a sudden disturbance rippled through the silence. 3 figures emerged from the gloom, their faces obscured by dark fabric. Hands seized Zuri's arms with brute force, and a metallic cloth pressed against her mouth, muffling her breath. She struggled against her captors, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. A cold blade touched her throat, its edge sharp and unforgiving. She was carried into the depths of the castle, down stone stairs into a cellar lined with floors of dark obsidian. The general waited in the damp room, his presence a cold weight against the air. He held a metallic instrument, a device of cruel design intended to pierce the quiet world of the king. He whispered his threats, his eyes reflecting a hunger for the throne. Zuri remained brave, her gaze fixed upon the man with a look of pure arrogance. Within her veins, the metallic blood bond thrummed with a sudden sharp intensity. It was a golden pulse of alarm, a silent cry across the void to the one soul she trusted. Bastien felt the jolt in his chest while he stood upon the battlements. His world stayed silent, yet his spirit blazed with a fierce awareness. He caught the faint, lingering scent of his own cologne upon the air, the cedar and ancient spice that had transferred to Zuri during their dance. It acted as a trail through the dark. He moved with the speed of a predator, his boots sensing every vibration through the mahogany and stone. His eyes, dark like obsidian, searched every shadow for the woman he had chosen. He reached the heavy cellar door and shattered the wood with a single thunderous blow. He stood in the wreckage, his form half shifted into the primal wolf, claws extended and gleaming in the torchlight. Primal fury radiated from his broad shoulders. He saw the general. Then he saw Zuri, bound and wounded. The bond of metallic blood flared with a protective heat. Bastien moved faster than the eye could follow, a blur of shadow and strength. The general's men fell before the king's wrath. Bastien reached Zuri, his hands gentle as he examined the thin line of blood upon her shoulder. He pulled her close, his forehead pressing against hers in a gesture of profound relief. Even in his silent world, the message remained clear. He had found her. She was safe. A dying guard gasped a final revelation about the general's estate in the Eastern Highlands. Bastien stood tall, his gaze hardening into the mask of a war king. He looked at Zuri, then at his loyal commander who appeared at the door. He understood the trap the general had prepared, yet he welcomed the challenge. With Zuri as his ears and his own heart as her shield, they would march toward the final confrontation. Their bond remained an unbreakable bridge, a light that would guide them through the coming darkness of the highlands. The narrow passage through the highlands consisted of ancient obsidian stone, the dark walls shimmering with a damp, slick moisture. Commander Soren led the small group with a steady hand, his knowledge of these hidden paths proving absolute. Zuri pressed forward just behind the Alpha King, and her fingers lightly brushing the sleeve of his coat. Even in the dim light of the cavern, the scent of his cologne remained a powerful anchor, the aroma of cedar and spice filling her senses with a feeling of safety. The air within the cave carried a sharp, metallic tang, the scent of minerals and cold earth rising from the depths. Bastien moved with the grace of a shadow, his boots making rhythmic contact with the stone. He existed in a world of profound silence, yet his awareness of the group remained constant. Zuri felt the pulse of their metallic blood bond, a warm and steady vibration that traveled through her veins. It acted as a silent conversation, a way for their souls to touch while they navigated the treacherous terrain. Whenever the path became steep, Bastien reached back to steady her, and his grip firm and his skin radiating a comforting heat. The passage eventually opened into a larger chamber where massive roots, thick and dark like polished mahogany, twisted through the ceiling. Water dripped from the stone, creating a soft, rhythmic tremor that Zuri felt beneath her feet. She leaned into Bastien's side, using their private language of touch to signal the presence of guards ahead. She tapped his right shoulder twice, a sign that two men stood watch at the exit of the tunnel. Bastien acknowledged her with a slight tightening of his jaw, his obsidian eyes flaring with a fierce, protective light. They reached the end of the cave, where a heavy mahogany door stood as the final barrier between the passage and the general's cellar. Bastien placed his palm against the wood, sensing the vibrations of the room beyond. He waited for Zuri's signal, his body coiled like a predator ready to strike. The metallic clink of a guard's armor echoed through the door, a sound that Zuri captured and translated through a firm press on the king's arm. With a sudden explosive force, Bastien drove his shoulder into the door. The wood splintered, the dark mahogany shards flying into the room. The guards stood frozen in shock as the Alpha King surged into the light, his presence overwhelming the small chamber. Zuri followed close behind, her heart full of courage and her mind sharp. The bond between them blazed with a brilliant, golden energy, a testament to the strength they found in their shared silence. They had arrived at the heart of the enemy's fortress, and together they stood ready to reclaim the peace of Oakhaven. The sun climbed over the jagged spires of Oakhaven, casting long shadows across the courtyard where the entire kingdom gathered in a sea of anticipation. At the center of the royal dais, carved from ancient mahogany, King Bastien sat upon a throne of polished obsidian. His presence remained immense, his eyes dark and focused as they scanned the crowd. The scent of his cologne, a heavy blend of cedar and spice, drifted on the morning breeze, reaching Zuri where she stood at his right hand. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk, her posture radiating a regal arrogance that commanded respect from every noble present. The general stood before them in heavy chains, his face a mask of bitter defeat. Yet, a hidden metallic device stayed tucked within his palm, a final attempt to shatter the peace of the realm. With a sudden motion, he activated the instrument. A sound of immense, ear-splitting frequency exploded through the square. Every citizen, every guard, and every noble fell to their knees, their hands clutching their ears in agony. The metallic resonance acted as a physical blow, a wave of pressure that forced the world to its face. Bastien stayed perfectly still. He remained upright, his broad shoulders steady, his expression serene. The sound stayed absent from his world. He watched the general with a calm, predatory gaze, his obsidian eyes unblinking. Zuri, feeling the vibration through her teeth, remained standing at his side, her hand resting firmly on his shoulder. The pulse of their metallic blood bond acted as her anchor, allowing her to resist the pressure that overwhelmed the rest of the court. The general watched the king in total shock. His plan to expose the king's silence had failed to produce the expected shame. Instead, Bastien rose from his throne. He reached out and took Zuri's hand, lifting it high for the kingdom to see. "My world is quiet," Bastien's voice boomed, vibrating through the stone and reaching the furthest edges of the square. "Yet, my heart is full. This woman, whom the world called arrogant, became my ears when the world turned cold. She saw the truth while others remained blind. She heard the whispers of betrayal while the court remained silent." A wave of awe replaced the pain of the sound as the frequency faded. The citizens rose, their gazes shifting from the king to the black maid who had saved their realm. Bastien turned to Zuri, his eyes reflecting a deep, abiding devotion. He leaned down and pressed his lips to her hand, and a gesture of absolute honor. The bond of metallic blood flared with a brilliant light, a golden bridge that everyone could now see. "Today," Bastien declared, his voice carrying a power that lacked every limit. "The woman who heard for her king becomes the queen of Oakhaven. Her dignity is our new standard. Her strength is our shield." Zuri felt a surge of emotion, her eyes bright with joy. Her arrogance had transformed into a graceful authority. She looked out at the people, her chin lifted high, her heart beating in sync with the king. She was exactly where she belonged. The silence of the king was now a sacred space they shared, a kingdom built on trust, vulnerability, and a love that surpassed every sound. The story of the deaf alpha king and the arrogant black maid serves as a profound testament to the truth that perception is a matter of the soul, not the senses. In a world that values physical perfection and social hierarchy, Bastien and Zuri demonstrate that true strength is found in the places the world often overlooks. Bastien's deafness, initially viewed as a vulnerability that required a mask of obsidian stoicism, became the catalyst for a partnership built on absolute trust. It taught the kingdom that a leader's ability to hear his people has little to do with his ears and everything to do with his heart. His silence created a space where solely the truth could survive, stripping away the hollow noise of courtly flattery. So Zuri's arrogance was revealed to be the dignity of a woman who refused to believe she was less than those she served. Her story teaches us that self-worth is an internal flame that no external circumstance can extinguish. By refusing to bow her head, she stayed alert enough to see the threats that others missed. Her journey from the mahogany tables of the kitchen to the obsidian throne proves that when we embrace our authentic selves, we become capable of saving entire kingdoms. Ultimately, the metallic blood bond represents the idea that we are all searching for the one soul who truly hears us, even in total silence. The moral is clear. True power lies in vulnerability, and the most insignificant person in the room may be the very one holding the keys to the future. So we must look past the servant's dress or the king's silence to see the brilliant, fiery essence within every human being.